Welcome to country and acknowledgement of country ceremonies have become near ubiquitous. You can't go to an event without a welcome to country. You can't land in an airport without acknowledgement of whose land you arrived in. However, now there appears to be a bit of a backlash, and finally some politicians come out against all of these ceremonies. Indeed, Andrew Bolt recently interviewed a prospective councillor from Western Sydney about this specific issue. The councillor said he was running on a platform of abandoning welcome to country ceremonies. Here's what he had to say, and I recommend you check out the full interview for yourselves, and I'll link to it below.
Quite frankly, the welcome to country ceremony has become overdone, watered down, and people are sick of it being shoved down their throats. It has very little meaningful reflection for the vast majority of Australians, and that was proven, I believe, overwhelmingly when they voted no to the Voice to Parliament campaign. And especially in a local government area like Cumberland City Council, where 240,000 residents reside and 64% of them were born overseas, the feedback that we are getting is, why do we need to be welcome to a country that we helped build? And we turned Australia, a great country, into an even better country. And we feel unwelcome when we hear welcome to country, but also, no matter where you come from, whether it's Anglo roots, ethnic roots, any background, we are all equal. And that's the overwhelming driving force behind this, that resident feedback and my personal belief that we do not need to be welcome into our own country, created a two-class divide as second-class citizens.
So what can we make of this? Well, first, of course, let me know your thoughts about welcome to country or acknowledgement to country practices. My thoughts are that the backlash has been brewing for some time, but it was catalysed by the Voice referendum. Before the referendum, people would accept ceremonies but largely ignore them as mostly symbolic. However, the referendum shows that these symbolic practices could have been astroturfing and priming people for real policy changes. All of these incrementally built up over time to lead toward an actual policy change that was not going to be palatable. People have realised this, and they've asked themselves what all of these increased ceremonies incrementally build towards. What is the logical result of all of these things building upon one another, especially when they're being imposed upon people or when people are being compelled to go along with the acknowledgement of countries when they are presenting or arriving at a location. Now, my general thought on this is whenever we're looking at these things, we need to consider both the denotation and the connotation of the ceremonies. So, for example, with a word, the denotation is the dictionary definition. For example, the definition of the word red might be that it's a colour. However, it can have a connotation in various different contexts. The connotation is the bundle of implications taken from that context, what that word might mean. For example, in a political context, red might connote communism. Around Lunar New Year, it might be celebratory. Around Christmas, it might imply something to do with Santa or around Christmas. Therefore, the word red has both a denotation and a connotation. And we need to consider this connotation when we're considering the acknowledgement to country. Because if we don't do that, we are being deliberately blind toward what those acknowledgements actually mean. So say, for example, we're looking at a welcome to country. Well, the denotation is a statement about Australia's inhabitants. However, the connotation could be that all people with an Aboriginal ancestry are interlopers, they are somehow other, or they are lesser, or they are also Rands, or people who came too late. This is especially when some of those welcome to country ceremonies are also actively antagonistic. It also applies when they are coupled with aggressively negative commentary, like at Sydney's New Year's Eve coverage. That is, the welcome to country can have a significant additional connotation from that context, and that connotation could be merely an imposition through to the connotation being actively negative and aggressive. It's important to acknowledge that connotation because if you don't, you are only picking up part of the message. You are only picking up the actual dictionary definition of the message without thinking about its implications. The acknowledgement of the country's statements also seem to go a step further, because they seem to be compelled speech. Now, while the literal words of an acknowledgement to country might pertain to Australia's inhabitants, the fact of being compelled to state those is an act of control and an exercise of power. The connotation, therefore, in addition to what I said about welcome to the country, is also about control and about erasing people's free will to question or decide matters for themselves. It's about controlling the narrative. The connotation, therefore, is about erasing free will to resist some of the demands that are being imposed. The connotation goes a step further than the mere denotation of that acknowledgement of country. And that connotation is what people are really annoyed about. And this really manifested in the referendum, where people saw that all of these practices were building up over time toward an actual policy outcome. They were priming people to accept or acquiesce to the referendum. They were astroturfing toward those policy changes. They were astroturfing toward ever more control. They were building up incremental portions of control over time. So, for example, it might have started with a welcome to country at a major sporting event, but then it becomes an acknowledgement to country at mundane events that are occurring at work all of the time. It builds up. The goal here is to have incremental small changes so that you don't notice them, but overall, it becomes a very large change that imposes upon people, like would have been the case with a referendum or a treaty or changing the names of various locations. There are also rather curious omissions in these welcome or acknowledgement statements. For example, they clearly omit the contributions of the myriad immigrants to Australia. As such, the acknowledgement appears to categorize people based on when they arrived, which can lead to outright racism, as we've seen in Australia's past in relation to things such as Asian immigration, for example. Categorizing people on when they arrived can in fact give rise to and allow and enable racism, and that's something we should not be encouraging at all, because racism is inherently repugnant and needs to be resisted, and the extent to which an acknowledgement or a welcome might be categorizing people based on when they arrived could be leading toward a slippery slope. The issue, of course, is that in a workplace setting, it is nigh impossible to resist these acknowledgement or welcome to the country ceremonies. Acknowledgements are often compelled, oftentimes by DEI departments or by management or by HR. The acknowledgements are required or appear to be mandatory, and if not explicitly mandatory, people feel as if they have to make them, lest they somehow incur the wrath of the rest of the organization. Welcomes have also proliferated, often pushed by politicians who seem to not genuinely care what voters think, as we've seen in Queensland with Stephen Miles seemingly pursuing a treaty despite what the referendum said. After all, in many electorates, Labor politicians are safe even if their progressive politics clash with those of their voters. The Labor left, for example, has realised that they're entrenched, and they can do whatever they want because in many electorates, they don't have a credible threat, because their voters aren't likely to vote for the Liberal Party, and therefore they can do whatever they want without a fear of being unelected. Now, the Liberal Party is often not actually that much better. The so-called moderate wing seems intent on pushing policies that the majority of Australians don't want, and many moderate members of the Liberal Party are in safe seats as well, which again leads to a problem, whereby they're pushing policies that their seats don't actually want. It's a problem in both parties. Neither party is necessarily better than one another in this case. However, with the Liberal Party, many of the seats that are actually pushing these policies especially, and that really like these policies, might be lost to the Teals anyway. Now, the issue with this, even if you dislike the Liberal Party, is it undermines the main opposition to the Labor Party, and therefore further entrenches the Labor left. That is, when the dominant party has no real alternative, they can do almost whatever they want, which enables them to become more and more extreme. This is why we need a credible opposition, and why it's often better to have the House of Representatives and the Senate controlled by different parties. Now, in this interview with Andrew Bolt, the councillor mentioned an alternative practice, which could be something people might adopt if they feel pressured into doing an acknowledgement to country. The councillor highlighted you could acknowledge the contributions of all Australians of all backgrounds whenever they arrived.
My group, the Our Local Community Group, we actually have a little speech that we say in council, an acknowledgement, which acknowledges all the community, no matter what your background. And we make a point of getting up in council and saying that we acknowledge not only the Indigenous people of the land, but also the pioneers that came out and helped build this country, and their ethnic population that contributed to make this country even greater.
This seems sensible if there is going to be an acknowledgement. After all, Australia has gained immeasurably from immigration from people from many, many different backgrounds. And if there's to be an acknowledgement statement, Well, it makes sense to note that fact. In addition, one might also thank the troops, who have played a vital role in Australia's longevity, its safety, and its prosperity. Therefore, if there is to be an acknowledgement to country, or you are forced to give one, well, a neat way to take back some control is to explicitly acknowledge the contributions of all cultures, including immigrants. You could also explicitly acknowledge the benefits and role of Australia's Defence Force in keeping Australians safe. Now, this might lead to a rather cumbersome acknowledgement statement, a rather long-winded statement. However, it is a way of reasserting control against compelled speech, while also stating things that are inalienably correct and that no one, including progressives, could rightly dispute. After all, a progressive will hardly dispute the positive impact of immigration and of myriad cultures, and no one can dispute the role of Australia's Defence Force, and therefore coupling them with the acknowledgement of country can be a neat way of taking back control in a relatively low-risk manner. The other step, of course, is at the next election, you can vote for alternative parties or vote against politicians that are pursuing policies you don't like. But do let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below.